today we're going to be talking about unreliable narrators.
Or are we?
That was my line. Welcome to the Writer's Gym podcast. The Writer's Gym podcast. Build creative confidence and grow your writing life with Rachel Knightley and Emily Inkpen. So, unreliable narrators, obviously that's quite a popular character trait, isn't it? Can we start by trying to define what an unreliable narrator is, please? What sort of traits might they have?
Do you want to go?
Sure, okay. Well, I think unreliable narrators are pretty straightforward, really. They're realistic people.
Yes.
Because we are all unreliable narrators. We all have a certain worldview, and we communicate that worldview, but that worldview could be wrong. Our interpretation of a situation can be wrong. So yeah, I see unreliable narrators as the most realistic characters that you can create, really. Yeah.
Completely. It's what it is to be a human being. And obviously, in terms of it being a technical tool of writing, we mean more specifically somebody who is either lying to themselves or lying to us.
So deliberately unreliable.
Well, the thing is, I'm not even sure it's deliberately, because if it is a mentality where they're also lying to themselves, there is the technique where they're not necessarily lying to us.
Yeah, they're just telling their truth.
They're telling their truth, which we're all doing.
Yeah.
But the separation from the writer themselves isn't so great ever, and I think that's what I find so enjoyable about the whole concept, is that when we embrace the fact that we are unreliable narrators, we stop going, how can I write this in the right way? And you embrace the fact that you are a flawed human being, and your character is a flawed human being. Even if they're a fish or a toaster, you're still dealing with a human soul, because that's the perspective we all write from.
Yeah.
You know, it's still a person, and the point of the story is that they grow, or if we're looking at tragedy, they don't learn what they need to learn and they don't grow. But yes, we're all unreliable up to a point, but it's totally about motivation, isn't it? If that character is hiding something, it's about why.
Well, motivation and intention, I guess. So I think I think there's at least three categories. There's one, the deliberately unreliable, the deliberately misleading, the malevolent version. The other one that you mentioned, Emily, is the just foibles of human memory and recollection.
Yeah, foibles.
And I think the other one is what Sartre called mauvais foi, bad faith, self-deception, so that we can actually believe things that at some point we knew to be false. And because we kept believing them, they have almost become a truth for us.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So I'm sure there are more categories, but they're maybe helpful for the listeners to think of those three as we go through this discussion.
There's a beautiful example. Can I just agree with you on that?
Well, thank you.
The Other Lives of Miss Emily White by AJ Ellwood. You don't find out until very late that this narrator, who is so well-meaning and so wants the people she loves to be safe, which is as far as I'll go without spoilers, has misunderstood something fundamental about herself that changes everything we've seen. And whether you interpret the plot as magic realist or not, in so many of these unreliable narrators, it's self-knowledge or lack of that is absolutely chilling.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a certain amount of, self-awareness of these people. It can make the difference between redeemable and unredeemable characters, because in order to grow, you have to have a certain element of self-awareness, and if the person doesn't, then, there is no saving that, really. There's no saving you until you know that to an extent you need to be saved. And I think those characters are often the most disturbing, really.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And so, Emily, we've heard an example from Rachel of an unreliable narrator.
Yes.
Have you got one for us as well?
Oh, yeah, there's a beautiful one too, really, in Nabokov's Pale Fire. It's a wonderful book. It's completely layered. It's about two neighbours. The poet is called John Shade, and his neighbour and self-appointed editor, Charles Kinbote. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book, wherein, if I remember correctly, and if I summarise the main point, is that John Shade is writing a poem about a very personal tragedy where his daughter committed suicide, and he's writing about this really, delicate and awful event and the sort of like what happened before and what happened after. Charles Kinbote thinks that he's writing about something completely different, and is basically reading the poem as a history of this country in the north called Zembla that may or may not still exist. I can't really remember, but I think it might have no longer exist. And he's saying, clearly this image is reminiscent of the, the snowy hills of Zembla and everything. And it's like, no, it's literally a physical description of John Shade's garden where his little girl used to play. And, and he's reading into this. But at the same time, his bits of the book, it goes from the poem to then the commentary and the sort of by Charles Kinbote, and you sort of get this idea of this person who is really kind of trying to hijack the work and is also telling their story. And it's gloriously muddled. It's wonderful. It's so well done. And absolutely unreliable. Absolutely, yeah.
We'll put links to both of the books that Rachel and Emily have referenced in the show notes of the podcast. But I want to go on next to talk about why might a writer choose to use an unreliable narrator in their work?
Why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
It's the human condition. Coming to grips with how we are unreliable ourselves and whether we've got the guts to grow through what we've learnt or not. The result of not being tragedy, where you don't learn from your fatal flaw and you die either by the events of the plot or by old age, if we're lucky, but you don't grow into a more actualised version of yourself. Those are your options. But it allows for layers. I mean, an example that's been on my mind is Never Let Me Go, Kazuo Ishiguro, where the child is in school and it's an apparently very privileged environment, but you sense something isn't quite right. And at first you're growing with her, working out what's going on the way all of us might when we were in school, sort of working out what we're about, what the world is about. And then the clues that she's getting, sometimes we're ahead of her, sometimes we're not. But because she's telling it from adulthood and you're already getting the sense of what her position in society is, the creeping realisation of what this society is, and that her unreliability in a way is just how bloody nice she is about it, and how much she doesn't blame the world for what it's doing to her. That's something you can only do in a way when not only is the narrator unreliable, but the audience, the reader, is being kept at a distance. And one of my other favourites on that, just doing that same thing but in a completely different way, is Girl on the Train, where you really do think she's in the wrong, rather than the person in a position of power and trust is gaslighting an alcoholic and the memories are not reliable. I mean, that was the whole domestic noir explosion with that, and with Gone Girl, with Amy, who presented what society told her to present, but did it consciously, did it entirely knowingly, and used it to her own ends. And on one level you've got a baddie, but on another level you've got this wonderful comment about who we get made into being. And sometimes we are so lacking in self-esteem that we don't know when we're being the true version of us and when we're being the version society has told us is a good idea. And I find that absolutely compelling and important, and that is why unreliable narrators are awesome.
I think it's absolutely necessary, and it's like, especially if there's trauma involved, because, they say people adapt in order to survive, and part of adapting is to, assimilate and to be able to live with certain truths. And then as soon as you're out of that stressful situation, working out again what's normal is a whole process. And you're kind of unpicking the unreliable in yourself. as the process. It's sort of like it's getting to the bottom of what is actually true about you. There's a lot of unpicking that needs to be done there. But if you are writing somebody, again, I'm just going to say, if you're writing somebody with authenticity in a world, and I think maybe this comes from the fact that I put my characters through so much trauma, and they are all traumatized. They are all, and I couldn't write them as reasonable and absolutely steady and consistent human beings. They are consistent within themselves given what they've been through, but that doesn't make them right. It doesn't make them sort of it makes them complicated.
Yes.
And the more layers you've got going on there as a result of experience and world experience, the better it is. But then it makes them by necessity unreliable.
So let's move on then to offering our listeners some tips and advice about unreliable narrators. I'm going to start with probably a fear that writers might have the first time they're trying to deploy an unreliable narrator in their work. And that fear, I think, is this: how can I be sure that my readers will get that this is an unreliable narrator? Maybe they'll just think that this person is telling the truth, in which case my plan has fallen flat on its face. So what's the answer to that?
I'd completely disagree with that. I think if the reader doesn't get that it's an unreliable narrator, then it's doing its job. You've arrived and you are gradually working out what's going on. It's very rare, certainly in contemporary fiction, for somebody to be or set themselves up to be completely reliable, because they're not. I mean, if you compare it to something like, I love Jane Eyre, I absolutely love that book.
Oh, yeah.
But from the beginning, her vocabulary is what it is unlikely that for her contemporaries or for ours would have been the vocabulary of a 10-year-old. She's morally and in terms of her strength and everything else already where she's going to be as an adult when we meet her, and then she carries on.
Yeah.
And it doesn't spoil the book for me at all. Most of my life is probably a result of that book in some form. I'm all in favour, but it doesn't really do it for us now in terms of expecting people to arrive fully formed. You are, if you're not prepared to be flawed, if you're not prepared to be, your trauma, your experience, you go through things, you're not a done deal. I'll just take one I was thinking of when you said that. The Lessons by Naomi Alderman is one of those narrators where another young person seems shiny and impressive, and it's all in the Brideshead Revisited camp, and he's learning about himself, but he's much more focused on this other character, so he's in the background. He's not quite as real to himself as the other characters are to him. And will he grow through that, or will he continue to be wallpaper? I think that's probably an experience that most of us can identify with at some level, that when you're young and you're working out who you are, that unreliability can make you try and pass as who you think you're supposed to be.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then that unpicking that you talked about, Emily, and the trauma response, and I'd absolutely echo that. That's how you feed into that you have to relearn or potentially learn in the first place.
Yeah.
Who am I? Who do I choose to be? Where are the differences between those things?
Exactly, yeah.
Emily, I mean, what are your thoughts on, the fear that a writer may have that their unreliable narrator is not seen as such by readers?
Oh, don't start out with any fears, because you'll never write the book. You've got to write the character, and you've got to write the character true, and if the character is true, they're probably unreliable. As I've said, I make this sound really easy. It's not. It's just a case of taking into account all of the things that make your character them, and allowing all those things to influence their interactions and how they see the world. And that can be based on where you're from, how you've been raised, how you grew up. This is all part of character development and world development. We were talking before about world building in a previous episode, where we talked about the building of a world, whether it's a real world that you are writing about that is still in essence world building, or if it's a completely invented world. You do have to know where your character stands within it, and how that is going to affect their worldview, and how that's going to affect their interactions.
Yes.
As soon as you know all of that, and you are being consistent to the character, and you are telling the story, you know that their point of view is affected by all of these things. If we were telling it from a different character's point of view, from a different place, coming from a different position in that world, you'd tell it differently. Yeah. That's the nature of it. That's just basic unreliable narrator, without adding layers of trauma and without adding intent, or without adding, sort of malevolence of, motivations onto it.
And all the levels of nuance that I'm sure we'll touch on in the next few minutes.
Exactly, yeah.
So I want to ask, first of all, let's get to the heart of the term unreliable narrator. Do we always have to mean by narrator a character that is the or one of the key voices in a story? I mean, do you think they must speak directly to the audience to be a unreliable narrator?
I'd never go with a must, because every rule will get broken brilliantly when it's for the right reason, and that right reason will come from the characters, who they are, what you're asking about the world, what you're exploring about the world. But an example where that didn't happen, that I enjoyed enormously, that really sort of unseated me in a really good way in the book, was a multiple viewpoint novel by Mark Haddon called The Red House. And like most successful multiple viewpoints, it worked because they were divided. So this chapter is this voice, we're in this head. This chapter is that voice, we're in that head. And you're moving through this family and this house, and you're seeing it from all their point of view, and it's very straightforward in that respect, and I'm enjoying it enormously. And then suddenly you're in the ghost's head.
Okay.
And you didn't know the ghost was there. It hadn't occurred to you that that was the universe that this book was in at all. And it did make you see, I won't say what, but it made you see certain things differently. And it did make you realise that you'd been wrong about things. And a minor character might just, simply by existing or noticing something that is entirely straightforward to them, unseat a bunch of assumptions you had, just your own self-confidence or lazy thinking that you hadn't noticed, just by existing.
Yeah. I mean, to put that in terms of, like, being in the real world, we all have those moments where people who are very different to us offer an opinion about their experience of the world that is different to our own, and we realise that, oh no, we're living in this version and it's not necessarily the only version of things, and that can be very unsettling for people sometimes, and people react accordingly. It doesn't make the alternative viewpoint wrong.
Do you think that the concept of unreliable narrators relies upon the human instinct to trust, and then therefore plays around with that trust?
I totally do.
Yeah, definitely.
I had a conversation with somebody about what lying meant recently. And for her, it was a much more literal thing than it was for me. I think something that I found difficult but feel like I'm now starting to understand is that often we will all say what we think is true or what we want to be true. I think we were talking about this in the context of copywriting, actually, that a job will say, yeah, we know you've got good and bad days as a writer, this, that and the other, and when that happens, here's what we'll do about it, and then lo and behold they don't. But I'm not using this example to say this is what happened, but the other end of that, being responsible for saying, here is what you said, here is what didn't happen. If I'm on the other end of that, if I've said, oh yes, we'll do that, and then I've forgotten, say, or, had those really good intentions but then been off in my own world, the way every narrator is of their own world, sometimes we need that poke. And I think that one thing that I would consider enormously human is that we're going to get it wrong, and we'll say what we want to be true, so that concepts like, I'll always feel like this, or I'll never do that, can change through experience. And it doesn't mean that we're being deliberately false, that we're literally lying, even if we are lying to ourselves, or even if we're being more confident than we're capable of being sure about. It's not deliberate. That's the limit of our power, and I guess the limit of our memory as well, we can only hold so many thoughts, and we will lose track sometimes of what we've committed to or said. And I think that's quite a frightening thought for most of us, that we're not, however intelligent, however well-meaning, however careful, we're not completely in control.
I think that I actually kind of embrace it. I have certain stories that I tell that I know are not 100% how they happened, but my retelling is really good. And so I'm like, well, let's tell it like this one's better. So I tell people about how Danny and I, my spouse, my surname is Inkpen, real name wasn't their original name, that it's their parents, their mother's maiden name, and we both changed. Now when I tell this story about how this conversation took place, they're there shaking their heads like, this isn't how it happened at all. And when they tell the story, I don't remember it happening like that. But I like my version better.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
I had that recently in a more Mandela syndrome way, where, you know, where society... there was that whole thing where everybody thought they remembered Mandela dying when he hadn't. And I had a mini version of that recently, that my favourite Tom Baker story is when I was in this autograph queue with my friends Alex and Ben, who were both very, very tall, and there was me and I was little, and when we got to the front of the queue and I made a joke about short asses in the front for the photo, Tom Baker said, "You are perfect as you are." And needless to say, the rest of my life has been kind of downhill after that absolutely perfect moment. But that bit happened. But Ben was at my house recently, and I said to him, "Oh, do you remember Tom Baker, blah, blah, blah?" And he said, "No." And I said, "How can you not remember? It was Tom Baker." And he said, "One of the things that is wrong with what's happened so far is that I haven't met Tom Baker." And I said, "Yes, you have." Anyway, texted Alex, took a while to get an answer. The answer was, it wasn't Ben. It was a completely different person. Now, the reason that this freaked me out from a memory point of view is that Alex had that on his notice board for years. I'd seen that photo every day for quite a long time, 20 years ago. I'd seen it for so much. And the minute I realised who it wasn't Ben, it was this other person. Suddenly I could see the photo again, and I realised how wrong it was. That I'd been telling that story wrong for years.
Yeah.
And it only takes one thing like that for you to realise, just because you know something strongly doesn't mean it's true. And I found that as a really useful writing exercise, because the whole show don't tell thing.
Yeah.
That's why if somebody says to you, "Oh, I was terribly upset. I've never been so upset in all my life. I was really upset." That doesn't get you the emotional connection. That doesn't get you what happened. But if you itemise what the dialogue was, what the reaction was in your body, what the thoughts were scrolling in your mind, if you give the sensory evidence of the experience, that is writing that communicates emotion. Whereas telling us how important it was over and over again doesn't do that. So I do use that. It can be part of being unreliable. It doesn't mean that your memory is correct, but you need to give us the evidence.
Good answer. So I want to think about the ways in which unreliable narrators reveal themselves. And as I was planning this, I was thinking that all unreliable narrators, probably their unreliability becomes apparent over long periods of time.
Yeah.
We initially trust them and doubts creep in. Do we think that's true? I mean, Rachel, you gave an example not long ago where you trusted them, and then something changed very quickly.
Yeah. To my detriment and that of my BA class at Roehampton University 20 plus years ago, the book we'd been given that week to read and come back and talk about was The Debt to Pleasure by John Lanchester. And we all went off and read some of it. And we all came back, and the lecturer said, "So what did you think? What were your experiences?" And we all went, the way you do when you probably haven't actually got through it. And he tried again and not much happened. So he said, "Who in here actually finished the book?" And not a single hand went up. And he said, "I put it to you that you have not been reading the book you think you've been reading." And I think that was all he said at the time. He might have hinted a bit more specifically that something is revealed very, very late. But because we were, I mean, not that I would have seen myself as an immature reader at 19, probably quite the reverse, like most of us. It's possible if I read it for the first time now that I would see what was coming or guess what was coming in a way I didn't then. But because that voice was so, to me, overconfident and verbose and florid language in the way that we were just realising, actually, no, guys, that's not good writing. Good writing is when you communicate authentically. I was going, what is all this? I didn't find out what happened at the end, and I lost that wonderful creeping realisation, as did everybody in my class. But then we went, oh, and we found it, and it's such a wonderful example when you speak the language.
So that's The Debt to Pleasure by John Lanchester. We'll put some of these books that we've been referencing into the show notes. But Emily, I want to ask you about that slow reveal of unreliable narrators. I mean, is that a technique that you've ever employed?
Well, yeah, I mean, all of my characters are unreliable.
In many
whether
ways.
Whether they're
multiple ways.
Yeah, exactly. Whether they reveal slowly or not. I did want to say that there's something about I've read books before where the unreliability is declared quite quickly up front, and it said, I'm going to tell you a story, and bits of it may be hard to believe, and that's probably because they are, or I'm telling them and they didn't quite happen like that. And the very upfront beginnings. But then as a reader, you still trust them implicitly. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
It's the whole, as a reader, you are still given to trust what you're reading and trust the writer for knowing what's going on and relating things as they happened.
To want to think you're on the correct side of conflict in a way.
Exactly. And then even though the narrative voice has said up front, this is not necessarily how it happened, but it's my version of events, you still read it thinking, well, this is what happened then. And I think that's more of a test almost of the reader. It's like, look, I'm going to tell you that this isn't exactly necessarily how it happened, but this is how it happened for me, and then just watch the reader believe them hook, line and sinker.
Yeah.
And so much of our lives are like that as well now. We know that sources of information that we consume are not necessarily correct all the time, but still people read the first thing that they read and think, yep, that's enough knowledge for me, and that's
I've got my
Wikipedia.
Cartoon goodies and my cartoon baddies, I'm set.
exactly and they're good. And there is that thing about acceptance as well, that when we as a writer present a character and listeners, readers, are kind enough to engage with that character, it's as though we as a writer have an authority in the life of that reader. At that point, they've given us time, they've given us attention, and there is a kind of implied contract that we entertain, that we inform, that we educate, or whatever. We deliver unto them a product.
Yeah. and
an experience.
and we have an authority in that position, don't we? And it's when we start to mess about with that authority, so unreliable narrators probably also play on that trait, that we as the writer have that level of authority.
Yeah,
so,
see, that can be fun.
Yeah.
Because you can do an awful lot.
Well, you can play with that as well, can't you?
When you're aware of that and you know what the power is behind that.
Yeah.
Then,
Subscribe to The Writer's Gym by searching for us in your favourite podcast app and clicking follow, favourite or subscribe. We were talking about the slow reveal of the unreliable narrator, or in some cases the very quick and shocking reveal. Does that mean, that slow reveal, that the unreliable narrator is a trope that you would tend to use in longer fiction as opposed to short stories, where there isn't as much time for us to establish their unreliability over a period of time?
The first horror story I had in an anthology in Uncertainties Volume 3 was a very straightforward ghost story where the character doesn't realise her own situation. Everything in her head is about what's going on for the other person, and that makes it easier for her to not notice what's going on for herself. We're so caught up in what we do notice, we're focusing on what we do notice, and it's easier, particularly when you're in an insecure place, to want to change or affect or help or do something for somebody else and then miss something about yourself. And over a short story, that burst can be really powerful, but it's definitely different. I mean, if you take, just as a contrast, The Collector by John Fowles, on line 1 or 2 you've got this very strong, deliberately badly written voice telling you that it's not really their fault and what happened wouldn't have happened unless it was for what I'll tell you later. And you've got this sense of he's already defending himself and you don't quite know what for yet. Knowing that something bad has definitely or almost definitely happened doesn't make it any less shocking as you get to know that voice's behaviour and what they've done and what they might continue to do. And because of the way that's structured, it goes on beyond the end of the book. And that's something that I don't think is novel or short story. I think with both of those examples, they do make it feel like the scary thing is going to continue when you stop reading. And
Emily, I guess, as someone who writes a serial drama, you have got a long time to develop characters, haven't you, and to develop character traits. Could you do that over a series where a narrator becomes more and more unreliable?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the thing is that you do have to kind of... It does need time. That's the thing, to do it justice. I think so many psychological elements in storytelling, you need the time to do it. And when they're done badly, it's because someone tries to get them into a single episode or into a single season. And you can't. These things take years. They take months and years to develop and to fester and to grow and to, and to consume. With the Dex Legacy, that is the series, the audio drama series, and then the books, we're on a timeline that is quite long. The audio dramas are when the kids are 15, the books are when they're 26, 27. So I know in the audio drama, having already written the books, I know where they're going. And I know the absolute mess that they're in at the end. And the audio dramas are almost like foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Completely. It's all just an exercise of foreshadowing what comes in the trilogy. Finally, what leads up to those moments. And
what shaped those characters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Absolutely. And it's not nice. And the thing is that I know that these things happened over a long period of time. Now, the seasons that we're working on at the moment, I'm actually almost glad that I know where we're at in the story. I'm not writing it as I go, because I know that it took years for this process to play out. And therefore, I start the process in season 1. We've seen a bit of it continue in season 2. Season 2 takes place over the course of a week. So really, we can't gallop through it too much in that point. So we get another update of that in season 2. It will continue to build. But if I was trying to get across an entire psychological process, and I didn't know that I had until the kids were like 26, 27 to get this thing to its final destination, I might be inclined to try and rush it, to try and get it done. And with those things, you need time and you need space, especially when it's psychological stuff. It's very relevant to some people. And if you try and smash it into one season, it can cheapen it. And you need to allow the horror to build. Yeah,
I mean, it strikes me that the glory, the beauty of the unreliable narrator is perhaps the penny drop moment for the reader or the listener. The point at which you may have had some creeping doubts about whether you could trust this character, but there'll be one moment where you just think, oh my God, everything I thought...
It's all a lie! It's all a lie!
I've seen the reverse done as well, which is probably worth mentioning, in the Rosie project, where absolutely upfront, this person does not think like most people think about most things is the premise. And it's him learning to trust his own personal sense of ethics and morality and who he wants to be that allows him to break his programming, if I can put it like that, that we all have an opportunity to grow or not grow. And he takes it. And that's almost the unreliable narrator in reverse, that he's set himself up as, look how unreliable or untrustworthy I am as narrator. Oh no, wait, I'm not.
Yeah.
Learning.
Well, I mean, my next question actually was going to be, I think we think of unreliable narrators as turning bad, maybe. We think of them as okay, we think of them as reasonable people, and then something about them, they either become more malevolent than we thought or whatever. But are there occasions where actually characters can be better than we thought?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We're
trying to think of examples of that now.
I think what I find most satisfying is when better means whatever better means for you. And that's why it can happen in...
For you as a reader, you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But also for me as a writer.
Yeah.
The one that I'm working on at the moment does see herself as unable to do certain things or reach out for other humans in certain ways, and all of the blood and gore and dark humour that she is going to go through are there so that she can go, I actually do have potential that I didn't realise I had, and it's up to me whether I use it for good or ill. And that to me is the hero's journey. Is it's not just goodies, it's I am a flawed human being at the beginning, I'll be a flawed human being at the end, but how I develop in the end is down to me.
Yeah. I think we're drawing to the end of this conversation about unreliable narrators.
Unreliably.
Or are we?
I mean, everything we've said is pretty unreliable, really. I mean, it's...
I think if we were to summarise, probably everything you thought about unreliable narrators can be challenged.
Yeah.
And I think our challenge to you listeners would be have a go at writing one. But Rachel, have you got an exercise or
Absolutely.
A challenge for us?
Here is what I would do to explore unreliable narrators, but also human conflict, point of view, all the good stuff. 6 lines of dialogue. Character A says something, character B replies, character A says something, character B says something, character A says something, character B says something. 2 separate pieces of paper. Write that argument or conversation, or whatever you've decided it is. I hope it's an argument. You'll definitely have the most fun.
Oh, yeah.
And the first piece of paper is from character A's point of view.
Yeah.
And the second piece of paper is from character B's point of view. And they have their own reasons for disagreeing completely, for maybe misreading each other, for all the different ways that same room, that same conversation can happen to 2 different people completely differently.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. I was going to say at the end there that writing arguments is a brilliant way to flesh out unreliability, because, I mean, the way I sort of say about writing arguments is you give it enough ammo to each character and then just sort of step back and watch them throw it at each other.
Yeah.
And what is truth to each character becomes apparent very quickly in an argument. Often the course of an argument is throwing these things about and then finding out what the actual version is that you can both agree on. That is often an upshot of an argument is, well, it happened like this. No, it didn't. That wasn't my version of what happened. My version of what happened was this. Well, how could that be your version of what happened? It was definitely that. I didn't even say that. Yes, you did.
Well, I think the other thing about arguments, and this came up in an interview that myself and Emily were doing a few weeks ago with the audio drama writer and director Ella Watts, who worked on Doctor Who Redacted for the BBC and various other things. She made the point that in an argument, often people aren't listening to each other. So you don't argue back exactly what character A has just
You just
thrown
shout
at you.
your version louder.
Yeah. And that makes the argument and you know, even conversations that aren't necessarily confrontations unreliable.
Yes.
Because we are not necessarily, and this is where confusions grow and conflicts develop, actually, because we were never listening to each other.
This was exactly what I was thinking, that in terms of human interaction, the goal is not to find an objective version. The goal is to understand both subjective versions.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that is as good a note to end this discussion as we could find. So, as always, Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, thank you very much for joining us on the Writers' Gym today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris Gregory.
Thank you for listening to the Writers' Gym podcast with Rachel Knightley, Emily Inkpen, and me, Chris Gregory. If you'd like to learn more about Rachel and the Writers' Gym, please go to rachelknightley.com. To find out more about Emily, please go to emilyinkpen.com. And for Chris, go to alternativestories.com. We'll print all these links and more in the show notes for this podcast. The Writers' Gym podcast is an Alternative Stories 2024 production for the Writers' Gym. Production, sound design and editing were by me, Chris Gregory.